Hello everyone, welcome to Ideas and Insights. I am Badrinath Rao, your host for this program. I wish to talk today about a problem that afflicts the vast majority of Americans. It causes enormous distress, exacerbates inequality, kills innovation and growth, and pushes decent, hardworking Americans into a quagmire from which they often cannot escape. I am talking about the ubiquitous problem of credit card debt. Consumer debt has ballooned to unmanageable levels in our country. It is greater today than it was at any time in the 20th century. What is worse, this trend shows no sign of abating. 91 million Americans have unpaid, interest-bearing credit card debt. Excluding mortgage debt, the average American adult is saddled with a consumer debt of around $30,000. 75% of this debt is in the form of revolving credit and deferred interest loans. Unlike installment loans, where one can easily calculate how long repayment would take and how much interest one has to pay, revolving loans carry exorbitant, less obvious interest and fees on the balance carried forward. How serious is this problem? In 2018, over 100 million Americans paid a whopping $143 billion in interest and fees on credit cards. In addition, they paid approximately $25 billion in overdraft fees, $7 billion in short-term installment loan interest, $6 billion in payday loan interest and fees, and $4 billion in title loan interest. Consider this. Banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve at discounted rates. Yet, today's median credit card interest rate is a mind-boggling 21% with no legal caps. Payday lenders are worse, charging interest of 360% annually. Big data and machine learning have considerably reduced the cost of lending, but borrowers have not benefited from any of these gains. Once accrued, credit card debt is hard to get rid of. It transfers wealth from the most vulnerable segments of our population to the wealthy, creating record levels of inequality and poverty. For instance, according to a recent study by economist Scott Shue and his colleagues, redistributing credit card processing fees into rewards and cashback incentives costs every low-income adult $21. It is a windfall of $750 for every wealthy borrower. Egregious as these statistics are, the popular perception is that credit card debt is a self-inflicted problem. Ascribing it to a flawed character, we tend to think those mired in debt are indolent, impulsive, and impatient. We portray them as imprudent spendthrifts. A more charitable view, however, recognizes that debt is a function of acute financial distress. The argument is that people are compelled to take on debt because the economy is in a tailspin, incomes are stagnant, and upward mobility is a pipe dream. The reality, though, is much more complicated than these characterizations. Elena Botella, author of a new book, Delinquent, Inside America's Debt Machine, published by the University of California Press in 2022, subverts received wisdom about credit card debt and uncovers the dark, carefully camouflaged practices of credit card companies. Until recently, she was a senior business manager at Capital One, where she ran the company's secured credit card and taught credit risk management. As a former critical insider in the credit card industry, Botella has a nuanced understanding of how it ensnares unsuspecting borrowers and traps them in high-interest, never-ending debt. Rejecting both the financial distress and impulsive debtor theories, she says that consumer debt is driven by how eager banks are to lend, not by how much families want or need to borrow. Banks liberally and unilaterally increase the credit limit of borrowers and induce them to use all available credit. Describing this as a portion size effect, Botella avers that how much we want is a direct byproduct of what is presented to us. Our desires and actions are heavily shaped by the context in which we operate. She goes so far as to compare unsolicited credit limit increases to the reckless prescription of opioids. Botella's book explains at length how credit card companies adopt a host of unethical, albeit legal, strategies to get more people into the debt trap. They include predatory lending rates, complex billing practices, charging retroactive interest, beguiling customers with rewards and incentives to divert their attention from usurious interest rates, withholding information from debtors, relentless mail solicitation and advertising, risk-based pricing, and thwarting attempts by government to regulate the industry. Delinquent, Inside America's Debt Machine, is a splendid work that provides a blueprint for a saner, more equitable, and transparent system for disbursing loans. Citing successful examples of regulation from Great Britain, Canada, Australia, Chile, and Europe, Botella delineates several strategies for addressing the anomalies of credit card debt. She advocates the credit union lending model and strengthening credit unions by relaxing membership rules. Besides, Botella urges the federal government to cap interest rates and end the dubious machinations of credit card companies through stringent regulation. Failure to do so, she says, will leave millions of Americans wallowing in debt. Moreover, untrammeled inequality and the resulting immiseration could imperil our collective well-being. Ms. Botella joins me now to discuss the main themes of her book. Welcome to Ideas and Insights, Ms. Botella. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with the title of your book. You call it Delinquent, Inside America's Debt Machine. What do you mean by the debt machine, and how does it work?
Yeah, so when I talk about the debt machine, I'm really talking about this whole set of institutions and norms that cause money to be transferred from lower and middle income people to higher income people, notably the managers of financial institutions as well as the shareholders. So those are folks globally. And I describe it as a machine because there's really this system of interlocking parts. And I think in the context of the credit card industry specifically, which as you mentioned in the introduction is just one of several types of debt, it's really quite interesting because almost all of the kind of prevailing practices have been built in the last 50 years. So in that sense, it's useful to consider this as something that had to be constructed rather than something that is inevitable or something that has always been there.
Let's begin with the four elements of the credit debt machine that you talk about. First, you say that consumer lending products are based on product terms that are hard for borrowers to fathom and are yet deceptively simple and attractive. How serious of a problem is this, do you think?
Well, I'm going to cite a study by Mary Zaki, an economist at the University of Maryland College Park, that really helped me conceptualize how big of an issue it is that Americans cannot correctly understand revolving interest rates. And so I'm going to make a distinction here between installment loans and the types of loans that people took out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, up through a bit of the 1970s, to the types of interest rates that people have today that are revolving and compounding interest. And what she found is that only about 20% of Americans could reasonably calculate how much interest they would owe on a product that was like a credit card, even though, notably, almost half of Americans do pay interest on a credit card, right? So that implies that the vast majority of people who are using a credit card really cannot calculate how much it costs. But most importantly, there's also evidence that shows that makes people borrow in a situation that they would not otherwise borrow. So Dr. Zaki also found that the majority of Americans could calculate interest rates for an installment loan. So that would be things like a mortgage or a car loan, right? These are products that work within the kind of level of math most Americans know and their way of thinking about things. And so what she found was that when interest rates were low, people were equally likely to borrow money when it was presented as an installment loan versus a revolving loan. And this was in a lab type of setting where she could control all the factors. And then as she gradually raised the interest rates up to 40%, what she found is that people's willingness to borrow on an installment loan basically plummeted, whereas their willingness to borrow on a credit card-like product stayed pretty flat. And so that's an indication that you can tell if an installment loan is a bad deal, right? Like you don't need to be a rocket scientist. You can be most people and know whether an installment loan is good for you or not. You can tell how much it's going to fit into your budget. Whereas with a credit card, it really just outside how most people think, myself included. And so what that means is that people cannot determine if it's right for them or not.
Let's move now to the second element of the debt machine. You say that the debt machine is predicated on the strong, though fallacious, notion that access to credit is a good thing and that people should be able to get loans easily. Now, isn't this a great idea? Why would you say it's part of the debt machine?
It's one of the most widespread ideas in American life, right? And that actually makes it really difficult to observe and deconstruct because it's really like the air we breathe, right? You hear this all the time from both Democrats and Republicans. You hear it from people who consider themselves sympathetic to banks, as well as people who consider themselves critics of banks. And what type of rhetoric you often hear is that Americans need to have expanded access to credit. You hear people both on the left and on the right talking about making credit scores more inclusive so that more people would have a credit score. And this idea that credit is a good thing that needs to be expanded really originates in the 1970s, right? When you started to have these laws passed to increase access to credit to women and to people of color. And in that era, it was true that credit, if you could get it, was typically a pretty good deal.
Right.
You had state interest rates capped at 8% or 12%. Inflation was not inflation was high as it is today. So if you could get it, it was a good thing. Once we uncapped interest rates at the state level and said any interest rate goes, it really stopped being such a good deal for the majority of Americans. And many people, of course, struggle with debt, and you can't really fully tackle the problem of how hard debt makes Americans' lives if you're really locked into this mentality that more credit is good, and more credit, of course, also means more debt.
Let's now move to the third element of the debt machine. You say that there is this widely held view that not having a credit card is a form of social exclusion, and it betokens a lowly status. I put it to you, Ms. Botella, isn't it true that we need credit cards virtually for everything we do these days? And so, isn't it fair that we would want to see not having access to credit card as some form of social exclusion? Why do you see this as an element of the debt machine?
I do want to draw a distinction here between credit cards and debit cards. I think some version of electronic payments is not going away, right? And that does impose a hardship on
True.
people who can't get a checking account. That's a smaller group than people who don't have a debit card or don't have a checking account, right? So I don't want to ignore the fact that, yes, if you don't have a debit card, your life is going to be pretty inconvenient in many parts of the United States. But there are some very significant differences between credit cards and debit cards, and that's also true actually if you pay your credit card in full. But there's this cultural attitude that if you don't have a credit card, you're not fully a part of the financial mainstream. And that idea or belief is one of the things that motivates people to get their first credit card and kind of dip their toes into something that often is quite dangerous.
Let's now move to the final element of the debt machine. You have identified asymmetries in information between banks and borrowers, and you say that banks routinely use their borrowers as guinea pigs and conduct experiments on them, A, without their consent, and B, without bothering to tell them what they found out from the experiments. And you think this is unethical. Tell us more about this.
So you're absolutely right, Dr. Rao. Credit card companies conduct tens of thousands of experiments per year on their borrowers. And this isn't just stuff like, is the envelope red or is it blue? Do you put the button on the left or do you put it on the right? Although those sorts of experiments also happen. It's also directly altering things like the credit line or like the interest rate and seeing how that impacts how people spend and how they borrow, right? So these are very significant impacts on people's lives. And it's interesting because certainly for anybody who has worked in medicine or has worked in a university setting, they would know that in those contexts, it's extraordinarily unethical to run experiments on human subjects without getting their permission and telling them the purpose, right? So there's a pretty big disconnect between what we allow in the financial sector and what we allow in other sectors of the economy. But it creates this situation where the reason why banks are willing to lend to somebody is because they know through statistical modeling that a specific person is likely to pay hundreds or even thousands of dollars of interest. And if that same information, right, based on these randomly controlled trials and then the statistical models that rely on those experiments, if that same information was turned over to the borrower, in many cases, the person would decide not to get a credit card at all, right? So the banks are really consistently one or many steps ahead of the consumers that they're lending to.
At the very beginning of your book, you rightly point out that consumer debt today is higher than at any time in the 20th century. Persistent debt is a distressing fact of life. My question to you is, how did we get to this point, and what do you think we can do to get out of it? Although the second question I shall explore in detail later. How did we come to the point where virtually everyone except the super rich is ensnared in the debt machine?
So this process really kicks off in the 1970s. And what happens in the 1970s is that there's a Supreme Court case that allows lenders to basically lend at whatever interest rate they wanted. So previously, if I was a bank in Minnesota and I wanted to lend to somebody in Iowa or South Dakota, I had to comply with the laws of Iowa or South Dakota. And
Correct.
those states might impose an interest rate cap. Interest rate caps were common all over the country. This law said that if you're chartered in one state, you can lend at whatever interest rate according to the laws of your own state, regardless of where your customers lived. And that kicked off a process where interest rates rose. And when interest rates rose, it made it much more attractive to lend, right? So that kind of concept makes sense in economics, right? When the price goes up,
Right.
the volume also goes up. So that's one of the first kind of incidences or moments that causes debt to skyrocket, is that banks become much, much more willing to lend, but also kind of the flip side of that is much more eager to push debt onto consumers.
You say in your book that Americans routinely overpay their debts. How does this happen, and how do banks and credit card companies get away with this?
Sorry, when you say overpay their debts, can you just clarify what?
Well, in your book, you say that be it in the form of interest or fines or hidden fees and so on, particularly with deferred interest rates and things like that, Americans routinely end up paying more than what they ought to pay. In fact, there is a certain degree of deception or trickery involved in this, legitimate though it is, or legal though it is. And you have flagged this issue. My question to you is, how does this happen, and how do banks get away with this?
Yes. So sorry, when I heard overpay for their debts, I just misheard you. So yes. So one way to think about how much consumers are paying for their debt is that interest rates have risen much more quickly than any of companies' borrowing costs or charge-off rates. So that means the percentage of consumers that don't pay back. And profits are rising at the same time, right? So if a consumer's costs are going up and the bank's profits are going up, that's a sign in some ways that the credit card industry is actually becoming less competitive over time, or banks are competing with each other less and the prices are going up as a result. Now, part of that is because there's been a consolidation in banks. The number of banks has been going down over time. But just as importantly, it's very, very difficult for consumers to comparison shop for loans, right? And so it makes it very hard to find out if you're getting a good deal or a bad deal. And there's a lot of different ways in which it's hard, but one that people might not think about is that if you apply for a credit card, typically you're going to be advertised a range of interest rates. Right. So that might be from 12% to 27%. And you don't actually know what interest rate you're going to get until after you have applied. And each application is going to be an inquiry on your credit report, which means it's going to lower your credit score a little bit, right? So it'd be like if I went to buy shoes and they said these shoes could cost anywhere from $60 to $200. You can only find out the price when you buy them. And if you want to return it, it's going to be $30. It's very difficult to find out if you're getting a good deal or not in that type of system.
Right. While discussing the profile of debtors, you explored a popular myth and say that contrary to the popularly held view, the vast majority of members of Generation Z are not people who have acquired huge amounts of credit card debt. In fact, it's people belonging to the middle class, people who are doing reasonably well. One would think that members of Generation Z who are struggling are the ones who get too much into debt, but you say, no, that's not the case. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, you're right. So it's both people who are middle income and actually also middle age who struggle the most with credit card debt, right? Which I think is counterintuitive to a lot of people because in a lot of occupations, your income also peaks when you're middle age, right? In that age range between your late 40s and your early 50s. And that's only when people's credit card debt basically continues to rise up until they're in their 50s, and that's when it finally starts to come down. And that fact, and also the fact that the people who have the most credit card debt are also actually somewhat high income, right? So in the third and the fourth income, 20%. So in the 60 to 80% is also who has the most credit card debt. And that has a really interesting implication. And the implication of that is that there are some ways that we could maybe think about what it would look like if Americans had less credit card debt, right? Because it's not this fact that the people in the most dire situations are borrowing the most, and those people actually have less debt, right? So they're finding other coping strategies, which of course might be quite difficult, but strategies that are not resulting in them getting basically poorer and poorer each year.
Another myth that you explode in your book concerns patterns of spending with credit card, and you say that people tend to spend more when the economy is doing well and not when it's doing poorly. Again, this sounds paradoxical because most people think that when the economy is not doing well, people need access to money and credit, and so they would spend more. But you say the opposite. Can you elaborate on this, please?
Yep. In the Great Recession, so in that time period between 2008 and 2012, it was really quite striking. Credit card debt fell very, very significantly, even though the unemployment rate was rising really fast. And yeah, Dr. Rao, you're right. It's very counterintuitive, right? You would expect that people would turn to their credit cards when they're unemployed or in other types of financial stress. And that pattern has repeated since the 70s, right? That unemployment rate is associated, high unemployment rate, lower credit card debt. There's a lot of reasons why, but one of the ones I think is most important to understand is that's also when banks are most cautious with lending, right? So they offer the lowest credit limits. They're less likely to approve people. And they do less marketing is just as important, right? And so when you would think people would want to borrow as a safety net, right? And this narrative or this language around safety net or even credit as welfare is a kind of phrase that's sometimes used. It's really the opposite of a safety net, right? That when times are tough, you use it the least. And when the times are a little bit better is when you get into the debt. And that means when times are tough, you're not borrowing as much, but you are paying off all that interest, right? So instead of smoothing consumption or making it easier, kind of leveling things out between good times and bad times, it's actually having the opposite effect. So it's really compounding that volatility in the system, which means it's making it even harder for middle-class families.
A central argument in your book, Ms. Botella, is that consumer debt is a function of how much banks are willing to lend than what borrowers actually need. So you are suggesting that banks and credit card companies literally induce people to borrow more than what they need. How do they do this?
Well, I'll tell you an example. I know we haven't talked much about my time in the credit card industry and how that changed my understanding about how this all worked.
Mm-hmm.
But so at Capital One, we would randomize folks' credit limits for tests, right? So not all the time, but in experiments. And so in that situation, some person might be randomly assigned a higher credit line, another person might be randomly assigned a lower credit line.
Mm-hmm.
And what we would see in that situation is that people would keep their kind of percentage of credit the same, right? So if they were using 40% of their old line, they would use 40% of their new line, right? So
Right.
Almost like clockwork, right? That people would that this kind of whenever the banks chose to lend more, similarly consumers would choose to borrow more, right? And what's interesting is that happened even when the credit line was not a binding constraint, right? So in that 40% example where somebody was not anywhere close to maxed out before. And so there's all these different factors that kind of come together, even this example about people borrowing the most in middle age, people borrowing the most when times are good. Those are all moments in which banks are more willing to lend to people. And so what we see is this trend where it's not when people are in the most dire financial straits that they borrow the most. They borrow the most when the banks lend to them the most. And so kind of the implication of this is that it's really all about the bank's incentives to lend, not really about consumers' incentives or desires to borrow.
Let me play the devil's advocate for a moment. Some might argue that borrowers take on debt knowingly, and it's their responsibility, therefore, to deal with the consequences. Secondly, even if your argument is correct and banks are trying to push debt on their borrowers, what prevents them from declining and being frugal? What do you say to this?
So let's kind of break down both of those points, right? The first one that you raised is that it's really the consumer's responsibility. They made the choice to borrow money, therefore they should live with any of the consequences.
Right.
And the second is this question about what just prevents somebody from not borrowing if they don't want to. I'll talk about the second point first, and I'll use an example of cookies, right, or donuts in the office. Kind of in the pre-pandemic, if you were going into the office, there might be somebody who would bring in donuts for a special occasion or even just, Friday. And in that situation, it can be very tempting to go and have a donut, even if you would not have gone downstairs or a block away to buy a donut for $1, right? And it's not really the price that's deterring you from having a donut in that context. It's really about the fact that it's sitting in your break room, right, a few steps away. And throughout the day, that the very presence of the donut, right, can stress you out, right? Because it's either I'm not eating the donut, which I kind of want, or I'm like eating the donut because it's there, right? And in that moment, it's a negative sensation, often either way. And the question then is, did the person really, quote unquote, want the donut or not? And that experience of stress and the kind of pain of having to avoid something, or the conscious effort of having to avoid something, is the most common experience of debt for low and middle income people, right? So the moment of this is going to be hard for me to say no to, which is why I'm uncomfortable with this situation, is like a persistent feeling among low and middle income people. So one of the things I talked about in the book is what would happen if you go on Twitter and you search a bank's name and credit line increase. And what you see is hundreds of consumers who criticize the bank at the moment that they've gotten a credit line increase, right? You would think this would be a good thing or a neutral thing, right? You don't have to use it if you don't want to. And they're mad because they know that that temptation is going to be basically irresistible, right? And there's a big distinction there between it's there if you want it or not, and you're going to have to exert the effort versus it is there if you request it, right? So for people who've never struggled with credit card debt or maybe have always been able to spend within their means, they might see those two things as the same.
Right.
But for many, many families, they are very, very different.
Aside from unilaterally increasing credit limits, you have flagged a host of unethical practices that credit card companies and banks routinely resort to in their dealings with borrowers. So it could be something like complex billing practices, deferred interest rates, predatory pricing, relentless mail solicitations, and so on. How big are these problems, and why do you think they persist?
I'll give you one example that's really easy to understand, which is the time your payment is due. Now, let's say you live in California, right? So, and your payment is due on, let's say, April 8th. You probably think that you can make your payment anytime on April 8th and not accrue a late fee, right?
Right.
But your credit card company might say that your due date is 5 p.m. on April 8th, right? And technically somewhere they're going to notify you of this, but it's not going to be in the kind of big letters when you get your statement, this is your due date, right? And what we found is that there's quite a few people who pay between basically up until midnight of their time zone, thinking that that is the due date, right? And thinking that they're going to be able to avoid a late fee. It's kind of common sense in a way that that would be the case, but many credit card companies, it's not, right? And it's not because the banks have never thought about this, right? So they're looking at the number of people who basically believe that they are paying on time, right? So who are maybe paying between 5 p.m. and midnight. It costs the bank, there's no operational or processing costs, right, to extend it to midnight, but they're doing it because they know that they can basically reap extra late fees just in that short time period, right? And charging late fees that now are often up to $40.
Right.
And for a person who, doesn't have a lot of money, that one $40 late fee can what tips their next month's budget into something that they can deal with versus something that's going to set them further and further behind.
While talking about the various reasons why people acquire consumer debt, you reject the squeezed out theory, where the assumption is that people are taking on debts because of financial distress. You also don't particularly approve of this notion that people borrow because they are impatient and impulsive. You say it is insulting to the vast majority of Americans who are by and large very responsible people and are keen to repay their loans. As opposed to these two theories, you advance your own theory called the wipeout theory. Tell us more about it.
Right. So at any given time, a middle class family is going to experience a lot of different things that feel very high priority, right? So that could be enrolling their kids in a good summer camp. It could be finding the right daycare. It could be, I know I'm giving a lot of examples related to kids, but we'll return back to that reason why, right? It could be, I really want my kid to have piano lessons or be able to participate in a soccer team. Christmas gifts are a big one, right? Birthday presents, flying to a family's relative or to a relative's wedding. These are all things where it's like, oh, if I can't give my kid Christmas presents, I'm going to feel really bad. And there's a lot of these things that fall somewhere in the range between a want and a need, right? It's not a luxury handbag. It's not these kind of outrageous lifestyles of the rich and famous sorts of purchases, but it's also not things that are standing between you and malnourishment. And in that space, the pressure to do all of those things, which again are not luxuries, right? People are going to feel quite bad if they miss the wedding of a close family member, right? That might mean a cross-country flight. These things are going to weigh on you. And for a middle-class family, often the pressure to do all of these things is going to be basically impossibly high, right? And so they're going to do as many of them as they can on their credit card often. But there's a distinction there between what if they had to go down the street and borrow money for just that one purchase, right? What if I had to go down the street and borrow money just for my kids' piano lessons, or just to get the ticket to go to a cousin's wedding, right? It kind of triggers a different thinking, right? And
Correct.
I don't mean to say you shouldn't enroll your kid in piano lessons, right? Like that's a wonderful and potentially quite important opportunity, very enriching. But the question then is what happens next year, right? Like next year now you're actually poorer than you were this year. And the trade-offs are going to become more and more significant, right? And that's what I found when I talked to people about their experiences with credit card debt. It was typically not shopaholic, buy material possessions. And it was also not things that you had literally no choice. It was those things in the middle. And the challenge, again, is that you're going to have to make more and more difficult trade-offs every year because you're basically going to be poorer and poorer as a result of your credit card debt.
Of the several suggestions you offer for setting right the anomalies of the credit card industry, one thing struck me as very intriguing. You are opposed to rewards, points, air mile rewards and points, and all sorts of incentives. You want them banned, abolished. Why? Why are you opposed to these incentives? Particularly when a borrower has been responsible and pays off his dues promptly every month. What's wrong in rewarding such an individual?
So there's really two reasons. The first has to do with how it's going to impact the life of the borrower, but the second is actually about how it's going to impact everyone else's life in the community. So I'll talk about that second point first. So banks charge processing fees, those are sometimes called interchange fees, to merchants. So that could be your, local drugstore, could be the gas station, anywhere you're swiping your credit card is paying a fee to the bank. And that bank is going to give a lot of that back in the form of rewards. And rewards are kind of on this ever increasing cycle, right? That they're getting, you might say, richer and richer. But in order to cover that processing fee, which really is not the cost of processing the transaction, it's really the cost of the rewards, right? So a processing fee might be 2.2% and the rewards might be 2%, right? So it's not really the cost of processing the transaction, it's really the cost of offering rewards. They're basically making the merchants cover that cost. And they're primarily doing that through passing along the cost to the consumers. Now, if I'm getting the rewards, that might be kind of nice, right? I'm getting cash back, I'm getting airline miles. But if I don't have a credit card, right? And those are the people who are the lowest income, right? The people in the bottom 20% of the income distribution are the people least likely to have a credit card, and even beyond that, least likely to have a debit card. Those are the people who are really paying the cost, right? So it's really a transfer of money to those people who are some of the lowest income, most financially stressed in our society, to the people who are already doing pretty well and are using it to finance, let's say, a vacation. So that's one piece. But the second piece is that it really becomes quite distracting away from what is the most meaningful part of a credit card, which is really the interest rate, or you could even call it the price, right? So it's really encouraging people. If you were to go out and buy a car, it would be the difference between picking a blue car and a red car instead of a car that maybe costs $40,000 versus $30,000, right? It's distracting away from the most salient thing. And one way that we can see this is that rewards are really becoming increasingly popular among subprime borrowers, right? So for the cards that kind of wealthier people have been getting for a while, those have had rewards on them for about 20 years, a little bit longer.
Right.
But you're seeing more of these cards that are marketed towards the most vulnerable and the most stressed set of consumers that in the past were very unlikely to have rewards, and now they're quite likely to have rewards. And on the surface, maybe that seems like a good thing, but those people are actually not getting many of the rewards, right? Because their credit lines are very low. They tend to max out the card right away, which means like they can't actually spend that much more month to month because they're maxed out. And that whole time, they're paying very high amounts of interest, right? And so just this presence of rewards of like, oh, I should put my spend on this rather than on a debit card because I'm going to get rewards does not end up being like a positive cash flow situation for a lot of lower income consumers. It's effectively something that just makes it harder to comparison shop, right? And what we see is people make the best financial decisions when products are less complex, right? If they're able to pay attention basically just to the interest rate between different products, that's when they get the best deal.
I am almost running out of time, but I have 3 quick questions, all concerning the way forward. I hope we can get through them. If you would please keep your answers brief. The first question has to do with repeated attempts by the government of the United States to regulate the credit card industry, right from the Truth in Lending Act 1968 on down. There have been several major statutes, for example, the Fair Credit Card Reporting Act of 1970, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, and the big one is Credit Card Accountability, Responsibility and Disclosure Act, popularly known as the CARD Act of 2009. We have made attempts to rein in the credit card industry as a nation, but our attempts have fallen short. Why do you think, quickly, we have not been successful to use the law to control the credit card industry?
So I'll say all of those laws were good laws, right? And the CARD Act that you mentioned most recently fixed a number of really confusing and abusive terms that were common on credit cards, right? So they were all good, but they were also all really rooted in the assumption that credit cards were mostly a good thing and you needed to kind of fix a few gotchas, right? Or that this idea that we should reform them because they are so important. And so none of them were really designed around a framework that equally weighted the harms of debt with the positives of credit, right? So I think we're only going to have like true reform that really helps the majority of the American public when we fully come to terms with the costs that credit cards have on everyday Americans.
With respect to other measures that the government can take, you have outlined 3 major strategies. You say that the government could consider disbursing loans on its own through the post office, as it used to do up until, I think, 1966. You also say that credit unions should be allowed to expand, and membership requirements of credit unions must be relaxed. And thirdly, you say that we must make sure that credit card companies do not get away with obscene interest rates, that there should be a cap on that. These suggestions are wonderful, Ms. Botella. They are very well taken. However, realistically speaking, what is the probability that we will see these things come to pass?
Well, I will say that there's actually been a number of very important rules that have been introduced since the book was released. Maybe the most notable of them was a rule that would, it's a little complicated, and this isn't quite the whole story, but that would basically cap credit card late fees at $8, right? Whereas now they're around $40. And there's a number, and so I'll just also say, if anyone is familiar, the way that the government writes rules as opposed to passes laws is like very complex. And so a law is kind of like halfway written for a very long period of time. But it shows that I think the new administration is willing to look at things in a different way, and is not so inclined to take the bank's word on everything and to kind of trust them about how it works. So it's going to be, if it goes all the way through the end of the rulemaking process, just an extraordinarily positive thing for American families. And I think some of these other pieces, right, that would require Congress to act, I'm not expecting them to happen tomorrow, but I think the more that we have these types of conversations and open our aperture of how we could think about things, I do think they're all possible.
Quickly, what do you think of the legislative initiative of Senators Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? They introduced in 2019 the Loan Shark Prevention Act, and it has some very promising features, including capping the interest rate at 15%, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think there is a real possibility that it might be enacted and make a change?
So what I'll say is that there's another bipartisan bill that has been on the table for quite a while that would cap interest rates at 36%, right? So that's quite a bit higher than what Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez has proposed. And I know it sounds like it's on the margin, but those two types of laws would have different effects. So actually right now it's already illegal to lend to members of the military above a 36% interest rate. So we sort of know that credit is still quite available to people in the military, right? And what they're not able to get really are the payday loans that are the most harmful. And so I think that there's a distinction there. And what you're trying to do when you set the interest rate is to choose something where credit remains broadly available, and where you're kind of bringing down the profit margins of the banks without eating so much into the ability of people to borrow, especially for very small loan amounts, right? So for a loan of $100 or $200, just the cost of originating that loan is a little bit higher, right, than a $3,000 or $5,000 loan. So I know that's a little bit complicated, but I think we're much more likely to see some sort of bipartisan action on that higher 36% than we would at a lower 15 or 12%.
I am almost completely out of time, but I must close this interview by asking you a question. You've talked about innovative experiments in countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, Chile, and so on. Very briefly, are there some crucial lessons that we can borrow from these experiments and implement in our country?
Yeah, so what several of those countries have in common, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, is that they've really put consumers into the driver's seat. And so they haven't really limited the capacity of the banks to lend, but they have said it needs to be really the consumer's decision. So the consumer needs to ask for the credit. The bank can't just offer it, right? And it's a subtle distinction, but it has a very powerful impact on how much people borrow, right? It's the difference between there's a plate of donuts sitting on your desk every day versus you can go downstairs and get them maybe for a quarter. So that's one of the most promising examples to me of the fact that it does not change a consumer's ability to borrow if they want or need to borrow. So it really is not a restriction on access at all. It's really a restriction on predatory practices.
Thank you, Ms. Botella. That was a very interesting conversation. I appreciate your coming in and sharing your insights. Thank you for that, and also for the wonderful book you have written, Delinquent: Inside America's Debt Machine. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rao.
That's it for this episode of Ideas and Insights. Thanks for joining us today. In the coming weeks, we will discuss how religion evolved and why it endures, written by Professor Robin Dunbar. In this book, published by Oxford University Press in 2022, Professor Dunbar examines religion's origins, social functions, its effects on the brain and body, and its place in the modern era. Our species diverged from the great apes 6 to 8 million years ago. Since then, our propensity towards spiritual thinking and ritual emerged. How, when, and why did this occur? And how did the earliest informal shamanic practices evolve into the world religions familiar to us today? Professor Dunbar offers a fascinating and far-reaching analysis of our quintessentially human impulse to believe. Watch out for an exciting discussion in the coming weeks. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.